Hey everyone, welcome back to another deep dive into history's darkest corners. Tonight, we're trading Roman sandals for papal slippers and swapping battlefield gore for boardroom corruption. We're diving headfirst into the absolutely spectacular moral bankruptcy of the medieval Catholic Church, an institution that turned salvation into a subscription service and made God's love available for a low monthly fee of everything you own. So before we begin this unholy journey together, hit that like button if you enjoy watching me drag historical institutions through the mud they so richly deserve. Subscribe if you want more content about powerful people behaving terribly. And definitely let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what your local church is charging for forgiveness these days. It's always fascinating to see our global community of cynics and history buffs unite in righteous indignation. Now, grab your favorite beverage, maybe some wine, since we'll be talking about people who claim to represent Christ while living like Roman emperors. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a story about an organization that made medieval politics look honest and medieval medicine look competent. So, you think the Catholic Church was always a beacon of moral authority and spiritual guidance? Oh, sweet summer child. That's like thinking medieval barber. Surgeons were just really enthusiastic about haircuts. Tonight, we're peeling back the gilded facade of medieval Christendom to reveal a corruption so systematic, so breathtakingly shameless, that it makes modern corporate scandals look like minor accounting errors. We're talking about an institution that literally sold tickets to heaven, turned confession into a blackmail operation, and somehow convinced people that poverty was a virtue while their leaders lived in palaces that would make emperors weep with envy. This is the story of how God's representatives on earth became history's most successful con artists, and how they got away with it for centuries. So settle in, because tonight we're exploring the magnificent, horrifying, and absolutely fascinating world of medieval church corruption, where every saint had a price, every sin had a payment plan, and the road to hell was paved with very expensive good intentions. Picture this: you're a peasant in medieval Europe, and your biggest problem isn't the plague, the Vikings, or even the fact that your entire diet consists of turnips and regret. No, your biggest problem is that the people who are supposed to be your spiritual guides, your moral compass, your direct line to the Almighty Himself, are about as holy as a tavern floor on market day. Welcome to the medieval Catholic Church, where salvation had a price tag and morality was more of a suggestion than a commandment. Let's start with the recruitment process, shall we? You want to be a priest. Fantastic. Step 1, can you read? If yes, congratulations, you're already overqualified for most positions. Step 2, do you have money? Because if you think this is about divine calling, you've clearly never met a medieval bishop. The church didn't just accept donations for positions, they had a whole catalogue. Want to be a parish priest? That'll be 50 silver pieces. Bishop, better start counting in gold. Pope, well, that's an auction, and the bidding starts at your soul and goes up from there. They called it simony, the buying and selling of church offices, and it was about as subtle as a cathedral bell at midnight. Rich families didn't just buy their sons into the priesthood, they bought entire dioceses like they were purchasing particularly expensive horses. And just like horses, these religious positions were expected to provide a return on investment. Your son becomes a bishop. Excellent. Now the family has access to church lands, church taxes, and the kind of political influence that makes kings nervous. But here's where it gets really charming. Many of these purchased priests had never actually studied theology. They couldn't tell you the difference between transubstantiation and a sandwich recipe. Some couldn't even perform Mass without a cheat sheet. But they could count money, and in the medieval church, that was apparently the most important sacrament of all. And speaking of counting money, let's talk about the church's favourite hobby, taxation. The tithe wasn't just suggested, it was demanded with the enthusiasm of a highway robber with a religious education. 10% of everything you earned, grew, or inherited went straight to the church. And we're not talking about a gentle reminder passed around in a basket. No, the church had collectors, and these collectors had the backing of both divine authority and very earthly weapons. Couldn't pay your tithe. No problem. The church was happy to accept your land instead, your livestock, your children as servants, your wife's jewelry. Your dignity was optional, but everything else was fair game. They called it serving God, but it looked suspiciously like organized extortion with better architecture. The church owned roughly 1/3 of all land in medieval Europe. Think about that. 1/3. They weren't just a religious institution. They were a massive corporation with branches in every village, city, and kingdom from Ireland to Italy. And like any good corporation, they were absolutely ruthless about expanding their market share. But wait, there's more. The church didn't just want your money while you were alive, they wanted it after you were dead too. Enter the wonderful world of indulgences, the medieval equivalent of a get-out-of-hell-free card. The concept was brilliant in its simplicity. Sin all you want during your lifetime, then pay the church to reduce your time in purgatory. It was like a spiritual layaway plan, except instead of furniture, you were purchasing salvation. The church had price lists for different sins. Murder. That'll cost you. Adultery. We have a special rate. Coveting your neighbor's ox. Well, that's practically a bargain. They literally commercialized forgiveness, turning repentance into a retail experience. And business was booming. Rich merchants could basically purchase a clean slate for their entire family. Kings bought indulgences in bulk. The church even offered payment plans for those who couldn't afford the full price of divine forgiveness up front. They had salesmen who traveled from town to town, hawking redemption like it was cloth or spices. Come one, come all, sins forgiven. Purgatory time reduced. Your grandmother's soul released from spiritual detention for the low price of everything you own. And the sales pitch was terrifying. These indulgent sellers didn't just promise heavenly rewards, they threatened eternal damnation for anyone who didn't buy. They described purgatory in vivid, horrific detail, painting pictures of souls writhing in agony, while their living relatives counted coins instead of prayers. It was emotional manipulation raised to an art form, and it made the church fantastically wealthy, while keeping the population in a constant state of spiritual terror. But let's talk about the clergy themselves, shall we? Because if you thought the financial corruption was bad, wait until you meet the people running this holy enterprise. The medieval church had more sexually active priests than a Renaissance romance novel. Despite their vows of celibacy, medieval clerics treated chastity like a menu suggestion rather than a divine commandment. Priests had wives. They called them housekeepers, but everyone knew what was really going on. Some priests had multiple housekeepers. Some had entire families. The church would occasionally make a fuss about it, issue some stern letters, maybe transfer a priest to a different parish, but mostly they just ignored it as long as the money kept flowing. And we're not just talking about consensual relationships between adults. The medieval church had a sexual abuse problem that would make modern scandals look like minor infractions. Priests used their authority to coerce, manipulate, and assault their parishioners with the confidence of men who knew their institution would protect them. And protect them it did. When accusations arose, the church's response was predictable: deny, deflect, and relocate. Problem priest. Send him to a different diocese. Multiple complaints. Perhaps a brief stay in a monastery for spiritual reflection, followed by a new assignment somewhere far away. The church's reputation was more important than justice, and victims were often bought off, threatened, or simply ignored. Some priests didn't even bother with subterfuge. They openly lived like medieval playboys, throwing elaborate parties, keeping mistresses, and treating their religious duties like an inconvenient day job. They showed up for mass hungover, mumbled through sermons they'd stolen from other priests, and spent more time in taverns than in prayer. The higher up the church hierarchy you went, the worse it got. Bishops lived like kings, complete with armies, palaces, and enough gold to fund small wars. Which, incidentally, they did. Medieval bishops weren't just spiritual leaders, they were feudal lords, military commanders, and political power brokers who happened to wear funny hats and claim divine authority. They owned vast estates worked by serfs who were essentially slaves. They collected taxes, dispensed justice, and maintained private armies that were often better equipped than royal forces. A bishop's palace wasn't just a residence. It was a fortress designed to withstand sieges, because medieval bishops made enough enemies to require serious military protection. These weren't men who had dedicated their lives to spiritual contemplation and service to the poor. These were medieval CEOs who used religious authority to accumulate wealth, power, and influence on a scale that would make modern oligarchs jealous. They dined on exotic delicacies while their parishioners starved. They wore silk and gold while preaching about the virtue of poverty. They commanded armies while teaching about peace and forgiveness. And the Pope. Oh, the Pope was in a league of his own. The medieval papacy was less a spiritual office and more an elected monarchy, complete with all the corruption, violence, and political intrigue that you'd expect from any absolute ruler. Popes had armies. They declared wars. They crowned and deposed kings. They lived in palaces that made royal residences look modest. Some popes were obvious criminals who bought their way into office and ruled through intimidation and violence. Pope John XI allegedly turned the papal palace into a brothel and was accused of toasting to the devil during drinking parties. Pope Benedict IX sold the papacy to his godfather for a substantial sum, then changed his mind and tried to buy it back. These weren't isolated incidents. They were business as usual. The papal court was a nest of corruption, where positions were bought, favours were traded, and moral authority was auctioned to the highest bidder. Cardinals schemed against each other like medieval game show contestants, except instead of winning prizes, they were competing for the right to rule Western Christianity. And the competition was fierce enough to involve actual assassinations. Papal elections were often decided by bribery, blackmail, or military force. Rival families would literally wage war to get their candidates elected pope, turning the selection of Christianity's spiritual leader into a violent power struggle that had absolutely nothing to do with divine inspiration or moral fitness. But let's get back to the parish level, where ordinary people encountered church corruption on a daily basis. Your local priest wasn't just a spiritual guide, he was a tax collector, a judge, and often a landlord. The church controlled not just your soul, but significant aspects of your daily life, and they weren't shy about using that power for profit. Want to get married? That's a fee. Want your marriage annulled? That's a bigger fee. Want your child baptized? Fee. Want last rites for your dying parent? Fee. Want to be buried in consecrated ground? Major fee. The church had monetized every major life event, turning sacraments into commercial transactions, and heaven help you if you couldn't pay. Unbaptized children were denied salvation. The dying were refused last rites. The dead were buried in unconsecrated ground, which according to church teaching, pretty much guaranteed eternal damnation. The church used fear of divine punishment to extract money from people who could barely afford to eat. But it got worse, much worse. The medieval church developed an entire industry around fake relics, selling everything from pieces of the true cross to vials of virgins' tears. Never mind that there were enough splinters of Christ's cross circulating in medieval Europe to build a small forest. Never mind that saints apparently shed enough tears to fill several lakes. People bought these relics with desperate faith, believing they were purchasing genuine pieces of divine history. The relic trade was massive and completely fraudulent. Enterprising priests and merchants manufactured holy artifacts with the creativity of medieval advertising executives. Old bones became saints' remains. Random pieces of wood became fragments of Noah's Ark. Ordinary stones became pieces from biblical sites. The church not only permitted this fraud, they actively encouraged it because, genuine or not, relics brought pilgrims, and pilgrims brought money. Pilgrimage sites were medieval tourist traps, complete with overpriced accommodations, mandatory donations, and souvenir shops selling blessed trinkets at inflated prices. The church marketed these destinations with the enthusiasm of a modern travel agency, promising miraculous cures, divine visions, and guaranteed spiritual benefits for anyone willing to make the journey and pay the fees. And speaking of miraculous cures, the medieval church cornered the market on divine healing. Official church doctrine held that illness was either God's punishment for sin or a test of faith. Either way, the church had the cure prayer, penance, and payment. Lots of payment. Church charged substantial fees to intercede with God on behalf of the sick. They sold holy water, blessed oils, and consecrated herbs at prices that would bankrupt most families. They performed elaborate rituals that were part medicine show, part theatrical performance, and entirely focused on extracting maximum payment from desperate people. When their treatments inevitably failed, they had ready explanations: insufficient faith, unpaid sins, or God's mysterious plan. The patient died. Clearly they hadn't prayed hard enough or paid enough money. The patient recovered. Obviously the church's intervention had worked. Please consider an additional donation to show your gratitude. The church also controlled education, which meant they controlled information, which meant they controlled truth itself. Literacy was largely limited to the clergy, giving them enormous power over what people knew and believed. They could interpret scripture however they wanted, invent traditions that served their interests, and suppress any information that threatened their authority. This educational monopoly was ruthlessly protected. The church opposed translations of the Bible into common languages because an educated laity might start asking inconvenient questions. They preferred their flock ignorant, dependent, and easily manipulated. Knowledge was power, and the medieval church hoarded power like a dragon hoarding gold. Universities were church institutions, and higher education was essentially theological training designed to produce more clerics who would perpetuate the system. Independent thinking was discouraged. Questioning church authority was dangerous. New ideas that challenged established doctrine were heretical, and heresy was a death sentence. The church's control over education meant they could rewrite history, suppress scientific discoveries, and promote whatever version of reality best served their interests. They taught that the earth was the center of the universe because that made humanity, and by extension the church, central to God's plan. They taught that kings ruled by divine right because that made political rebellion equivalent to rebellion against God. They taught that poverty was a virtue because that made it easier to extract wealth from the poor. But let's talk about the Inquisition, shall we? Because if you thought the everyday corruption was bad, wait until you see what happened when the church decided someone was a threat to their authority. The Inquisition was the medieval church's special police force, dedicated to finding, torturing, and killing anyone who dared to question church doctrine or authority. And they were very good at their jobs. Inquisitors had the authority to arrest, torture, and execute anyone they deemed heretical, and their definition of heresy was conveniently broad. Questioning church teachings, heresy; refusing to pay church taxes, heresy; being too educated while not being clergy, suspicious, probably heretical; being a woman with opinions, definitely heretical. The Inquisition operated outside normal legal systems. They could arrest people without evidence, torture them to extract confessions, and execute them without appeal. Their proceedings were secret, their methods were brutal, and their verdicts were final. They were accountable only to church authority, which meant they were essentially accountable to no one, and profitable. Oh, were they profitable? When the Inquisition condemned someone for heresy, they confiscated all their property. House, land, livestock, money, possessions, everything went to the church. This created a rather obvious incentive to find people guilty, and the Inquisition rarely disappointed. Rich merchants were particularly attractive targets. Jewish communities were systematically persecuted and robbed. Anyone who had accumulated wealth while not being properly subservient to church authority was at risk. The Inquisition wasn't just about enforcing religious orthodoxy, it was about wealth transfer on an industrial scale. The torture was horrific and creative. The Inquisition developed techniques designed to maximize pain while keeping victims alive long enough to confess. They had professional torturers, specialized equipment, and detailed manuals describing the most effective methods of extracting confessions. They turned human suffering into a science. And here's the truly twisted part. The church genuinely believed they were doing God's work. They tortured people to save their souls. They killed people to protect the faith. They accumulated vast wealth to serve divine purposes. Their corruption wasn't cynical, it was fanatical. They weren't just greedy. They were convinced that their greed served a higher purpose. This combination of absolute moral authority and complete moral corruption created a system that was uniquely destructive. The medieval church had the power of kings, the wealth of merchants, and the righteousness of prophets, but none of the accountability that might have restrained their excesses. They could declare wars and call them crusades. They could steal land and call it divine will. They could torture people and call it salvation. They could accumulate obscene wealth and call it serving God. Their corruption was sanctified, their greed was blessed, and their violence was holy. And the most infuriating part, they preached constantly about the evils of worldly wealth and material corruption. Sunday sermons condemned greed, pride, and the pursuit of earthly power, while the priests delivering these sermons lived like medieval celebrities. They taught that the meek would inherit the earth, while systematically robbing the meek of everything they owned. The hypocrisy was breathtaking in its scope and shamelessness. Church leaders who owned more gold than most kingdoms preached about the virtue of poverty. Priests who maintained multiple mistresses lectured about sexual purity. Bishops who commanded armies preached about peace and forgiveness. Popes who lived in palaces talked about following Christ's example of humble service. But perhaps the most damaging aspect of medieval church corruption was how it poisoned the very concept of moral authority. When the institution that claimed to represent God on earth was obviously motivated by greed, power, and worldly ambition, it became impossible to take seriously any moral claims they made. People still believed in God, still feared hell, still hoped for salvation. But they increasingly recognized that the church was a human institution with very human flaws. This recognition laid the groundwork for the Protestant Reformation, which was essentially a massive customer revolt against centuries of ecclesiastical fraud. The sale of indulgences became particularly offensive to people who had watched the church accumulate vast wealth while preaching about spiritual poverty. When people could literally see church officials living in luxury purchased with money that was supposed to buy forgiveness for sins, the entire system's credibility collapsed. Martin Luther's complaints about church corruption weren't revolutionary ideas. They were observations that anyone with eyes could make. The church had become so obviously corrupt that defending it required either willful blindness or complicity in the corruption. But even Luther probably didn't grasp the full extent of the problem. Medieval church corruption wasn't just about individual bad actors or isolated incidents. It was systematic, institutional, and deeply embedded in the church's structure and culture. The corruption wasn't a bug in the system, it was a feature. The church had evolved into an organization that was perfectly designed to extract wealth from believers, while providing minimal spiritual services in return. It was a medieval protection racket with better marketing and fancier buildings. Pay your fees, follow the rules, don't ask questions, and maybe you'll avoid eternal damnation. And for centuries it worked. People paid their tithes, bought their indulgences, submitted to church authority, and hoped for the best. They built magnificent cathedrals that stood as monuments to their faith and the church's wealth. They funded crusades that enriched church leaders while devastating entire regions. They supported institutions that claimed to serve God while obviously serving only themselves. The truly tragic part is how much good the medieval church could have done with all that wealth and influence. Instead of building palaces for bishops, they could have built hospitals for the sick. Instead of funding armies, they could have fed the hungry. Instead of accumulating gold, they could have spread literacy and education. But that would have required the church to actually follow the teachings of the person they claim to represent. And Jesus of Nazareth, that radical preacher who threw merchants out of the temple and preached about serving the poor, would have been horrified by what his followers had built in his name. The medieval Catholic Church had become everything Christ, had preached against wealthy, powerful, hypercritical, and oppressive. They worshipped money while claiming to worship God. They served kings while claiming to serve heaven. They built earthly kingdoms while preaching about spiritual salvation. And they got away with it for centuries because they had successfully convinced people that questioning the church was equivalent to questioning God. They wrapped their corruption in divine authority, making criticism not just dangerous but seemingly blasphemous. The corruption was so pervasive that it infected every level of the church hierarchy. Village priests sold sacraments for profit. Bishops traded church offices like commodities. Cardinals plotted against each other for political advantage. Popes lived like emperors while claiming to be servants of servants. It was a system that rewarded greed, punished integrity, and turned spiritual authority into commercial opportunity. The more corrupt you were, the more successful you became. The more money you extracted from believers, the higher you rose in the hierarchy. The more willing you were to abuse your authority, the more authority you were given. And through it all, ordinary believers continued to have faith, not in the church necessarily, but in the God they believed the church represented. They distinguished between the divine message and the human messengers, between the spiritual truth and the institutional lies. This faith was what ultimately brought down the medieval church's monopoly on religious authority. When people realized they could have a relationship with God that didn't require paying fees to corrupt priests, the entire system began to collapse. The Protestant Reformation wasn't just a theological revolution, it was a consumer revolt. People had finally gotten fed up with paying premium prices for substandard spiritual services from obviously corrupt providers. They wanted their money back, and their dignity restored, and their faith returned to them. The medieval Catholic Church's corruption was ultimately self-defeating. By turning religion into a business, they made it possible for competitors to offer better products at lower prices. By making their greed so obvious, they made reform inevitable. By claiming divine authority while displaying human weakness, they undermined their own credibility. The legacy of medieval church corruption extends far beyond the religious sphere. It demonstrated how absolute power corrupts absolutely, how institutional authority can be abused for personal gain, and how noble ideals can be perverted to serve ignoble purposes. It showed that no institution, no matter how sacred its mission or divine its claimed authority, is immune to human corruption. It proved that moral authority must be earned through moral behavior, not claimed through hereditary privilege or institutional position. The medieval church's corruption also revealed the danger of combining spiritual authority with temporal power. When the same institution that claims to represent God also controls earthly wealth and political influence, the temptation to abuse that power becomes almost irresistible. Perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated that corruption thrives in darkness and dies in light. The medieval church's abuses were possible partly because information was controlled, education was limited, and criticism was dangerous. When people gained access to information, learned to read, and felt safe expressing dissent, the corruption became unsustainable. The story of medieval church corruption is ultimately a story about human nature, institutional power, and the eternal struggle between idealism and greed. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when noble institutions lose sight of their noble purposes, when spiritual leaders become worldly politicians, and when moral authority is used to justify immoral behavior. It's also a story about the resilience of human faith and the power of reform movements to challenge corrupt institutions. The medieval church's corruption was eventually confronted, reformed, and largely corrected, proving that even the most entrenched institutional corruption can be overcome by persistent moral pressure. The medieval Catholic Church's corruption was a historical reality that shaped European civilization for centuries. It influenced politics, economics, culture, and individual lives in ways that are still felt today. Understanding this corruption helps us understand how institutions can fail their stated missions while still maintaining power and influence. It also helps us recognize similar patterns in modern institutions, religious and secular alike. The temptations that corrupted medieval church leaders, wealth, power, prestige, immunity from accountability still exist today, and they still corrupt individuals and institutions that succumb to them. The medieval church's corruption was not unique in its basic mechanics, only in its scale and duration. The same human weaknesses that turned medieval priests into con artists and bishops into warlords can turn modern leaders in any field into corrupt abusers of their authority. The difference is that modern societies generally have better systems of accountability, transparency, and reform. We have free press, democratic institutions, competing sources of information, and legal systems that at least theoretically apply to everyone equally. But these safeguards are only as strong as the people who maintain them, and they require constant vigilance to prevent the kind of systematic corruption that characterized the medieval church. Power still corrupts, authority still tempts abuse, and institutional self-interest still conflicts with stated missions. The medieval church's corruption ultimately ended not because the corrupt leaders developed consciences, but because external pressures made corruption unsustainable. Competing religious movements, political changes, economic developments, and social reforms combined to create an environment where the old corruption could no longer survive. This suggests that preventing institutional corruption requires not just good intentions and moral leadership, but structural safeguards that make corruption difficult and costly. It requires transparency that makes corruption visible, accountability that makes corruption punishable, and competition that makes corruption unprofitable. The medieval Catholic Church's corruption was a tragedy that affected millions of lives over many centuries. It perverted noble ideals, wasted enormous resources, and caused immeasurable human suffering. But it also ultimately led to reforms that made the Church more accountable, more transparent, and more faithful to its stated mission. In the end, the story of medieval Church corruption is both a warning about the dangers of unchecked institutional power and a testament to the ultimate power of reform movements to challenge and change corrupt institutions. It reminds us that no institution is too powerful, too sacred, or too entrenched to be reformed when enough people demand change. The corrupt medieval Church teaches us that institutional reform is always possible, but it's never easy and it's never guaranteed. It requires courage from reformers, pressure from outside forces, and ultimately a recognition that institutions exist to serve their stated purposes, not to enrich and empower their leaders. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches us that moral authority cannot be claimed or inherited. It must be earned through moral behavior and maintained through constant vigilance against the corrupting influences of power, wealth, and prestige that tempt all human institutions, religious and secular alike. But let's dive deeper into the specific mechanics of how this corruption actually worked on a day-to-day basis, because the devil, as they say, was in the details. And the medieval Church had more devils in their details than a Renaissance painting of hell. Consider the life of Brother Marcus, a fictional but entirely typical parish priest in 13th century England. Marcus didn't wake up one morning and decide to become a corrupt religious leader. No, corruption in the medieval Church was more like a slow, acting poison, seeping into every aspect of religious life until what had once been sacred became purely transactional. Marcus inherited his position from his uncle, who had purchased it from the local bishop for the equivalent of a small farm. This wasn't unusual. Clerical positions were family businesses, passed down through generations like any other valuable property. Never mind that priests were supposed to be celibate and therefore shouldn't have had heirs. The Church had developed creative ways around that little theological inconvenience. His first lesson in church economics came during his installation ceremony. The bishop who ordained him made it very clear that the position came with expectations. Marcus owed the bishop a percentage of all parish income, plus special payments on religious holidays, plus additional fees for any special services the bishop might provide. It was like a franchise operation, except instead of hamburgers, they were selling salvation. Marcus quickly learned that his parishioners were not his congregation, they were his customers. Every service he provided had a price, and haggling was not only expected but encouraged. Baptism started at one rate, but if you wanted holy water that had actually been blessed by a bishop, instead of just regular water with a prayer mumbled over it, that was extra. Wedding ceremonies had base prices, but if you wanted the church decorated with flowers, or if you wanted the ceremony to last longer than 10 minutes, or if you wanted Marcus to actually remember your names during the vows, well, those were all premium services. The funeral business was particularly lucrative. Desperate families would pay almost anything to ensure their loved ones received proper last rites and burial in consecrated ground. Marcus learned to read grief like a merchant reads market prices, adjusting his fees based on how much emotional distress he could detect. A widow crying over her husband's deathbed, double rate. Children begging for their parents' salvation, triple rate, plus a surcharge for urgency. But the real money was in fear management. Marcus discovered that his most profitable service was not conducting religious ceremonies, but selling relief from religious anxiety. Medieval people lived in constant terror of damnation, and Marcus learned to amplify that terror for profit. His Sunday sermons became masterclasses in spiritual intimidation. He would describe hell in vivid, horrific detail. painting pictures of eternal torment that left his congregation trembling with fear. Then, just when the terror reached its peak, he would offer solutions. Special prayers that could reduce your time in purgatory for a small donation. Blessed candles that could protect your home from demons, available after the service. Holy medals that could intercede with saints on your behalf, priced according to the saint's perceived influence with God. Marcus kept detailed records of his parishioners' sins, learned through confession, and used this information to maximize his income. A merchant who confessed to cheating customers would find himself paying premium rates for forgiveness. A wife who admitted to adultery would discover that her spiritual rehabilitation required extensive and expensive penance. Marcus had turned the confessional into a combination therapy session and blackmail operation. He also learned the art of manufacturing miracles. When desperate people came seeking divine intervention for illness or misfortune, Marcus would perform elaborate rituals involving expensive holy relics, blessed oils, and consecrated herbs. If the person recovered, it was obviously due to his spiritual intercession, and they owed him a substantial fee for his services. If they didn't recover, well, clearly God had other plans, and they still owed him for trying. The relic trade was Marcus's side business. He had connections with merchants who specialized in holy artifacts, and his church became a showroom for spiritual merchandise. A piece of St. Peter's fishing net, a splinter from the manger where Christ was born, a vial of tears shed by the Virgin Mary. Never mind that there were hundreds of identical items being sold in churches across Europe. Faith, Marcus learned, was more profitable than authenticity, but Marcus's corruption went beyond simple financial exploitation. He used his position of spiritual authority to satisfy his personal desires in ways that would have made his parishioners revolt if they had known the full extent of his behavior. His vow of celibacy was treated as a rough guideline rather than a sacred commitment. He had a housekeeper who bore him 3 children, all of whom he supported with church funds while publicly preaching about the virtues of sexual purity. When young women came to him for spiritual guidance, Marcus learned to identify those who were vulnerable, desperate, or isolated. He would gradually introduce physical contact into his counseling, framing it as spiritual healing or divine comfort. His position of religious authority made resistance seem not just difficult but blasphemous. Who were these women to question God's representative on earth? Marcus's corruption corrupted others around him. His assistant, initially idealistic about serving God, learned that moral flexibility was essential for advancement in the church hierarchy. The church treasurer, originally honest about financial matters, discovered that creative accounting was not just tolerated but expected. The local monastery, once dedicated to prayer and contemplation, became a business operation focused on land acquisition and debt collection. The entire religious ecosystem around Marcus adapted to support and enable his corruption. Local nobles found it convenient to have a priest who was willing to bless their questionable land acquisitions and overlook their moral failings in exchange for generous donations. Merchants appreciated having a religious leader who understood that commerce required moral compromises and who could provide religious justifications for practices that might otherwise seem unethical. Marcus's corruption even infected the physical space of his church. The building itself became a monument to greed disguised as devotion. The altar was cluttered with expensive relics that generated income through pilgrim donations. The walls were decorated with paintings that emphasized divine punishment rather than divine love. Because fear was more profitable than hope, the confessional was positioned to maximize privacy and minimize interruption, facilitating both spiritual manipulation and physical abuse. But perhaps most insidiously, Marcus's corruption corrupted the very concept of religious faith in his community. People still believed in God, but they increasingly understood that accessing God required paying Marcus. They still hoped for salvation, but they learned that salvation had a price tag. They still sought spiritual comfort, but they discovered that comfort was a commercial transaction. Children growing up in Marcus's parish learned that religion was essentially a protection racket with better marketing. Pay your fees, follow the rules, don't ask uncomfortable questions, and maybe you'll avoid eternal damnation. Challenge the system. And you'll face not just spiritual consequences, but social and economic retaliation. This was the true genius of medieval church corruption. It didn't just steal people's money, it stole their spiritual autonomy. It convinced people that they couldn't have a direct relationship with God. That salvation required institutional mediation, and that questioning religious authority was equivalent to questioning God himself. The corruption became self-perpetuating because it created a system where moral people were gradually driven out while immoral people were rewarded and promoted. Idealistic young priests who actually wanted to serve God and help people found themselves marginalized, transferred to remote parishes, or forced out of the church entirely. Meanwhile, priests like Marcus, who understood that religion was really a business, thrived and advanced. This process of moral selection meant that over time, the church hierarchy became increasingly dominated by people who were fundamentally corrupt. They weren't evil in any dramatic sense. They were simply people who had learned to use religious authority for personal gain, and who saw nothing wrong with that arrangement. The corruption also became institutionalized through church law and practice. Rules that originally existed to protect spiritual integrity were twisted to protect corrupt practices. The requirement for clerical celibacy, originally intended to ensure that priests devoted themselves fully to God, became a tool for controlling and blackmailing clergy who violated their vows. The confidentiality of confession, originally meant to encourage honest repentance, became a way to gather compromising information about parishioners. Church courts, originally established to handle religious disputes fairly, became venues for extracting fines and fees from anyone who challenged church authority. Canon law, originally based on biblical principles of justice and mercy, evolved into a complex system designed to maximize church income and minimize accountability. The educational system that the church controlled became a machine for producing more corrupt clergy. Young men entering seminary learned not theology, but church politics. They studied not the Bible, but the most effective methods of extracting money from believers. They were taught not to serve God, but to serve the institution that claimed to represent God. This educational corruption ensured that each new generation of clergy was more corrupt than the last. Fresh seminary graduates arrived at their first parishes already trained in the techniques of spiritual extortion, already convinced that their personal comfort was more important than their parishioners' welfare, already skilled in the art of using religious fear for financial gain. The corruption was also protected by a comprehensive system of mutual protection among corrupt clergy. Priests covered for each other's moral failings. Bishops protected their subordinates from consequences, and the Pope protected the entire system from external criticism. It was like a medieval version of organized crime, except with better public relations and tax-exempt status. When accusations of corruption arose, the Church had well-developed procedures for managing the scandal. Deny everything initially, then admit only to minor failings while emphasizing the accuser's lack of standing to judge God's representatives. If evidence became overwhelming, transfer the offending cleric to a different location where he could start fresh with a new set of victims. If public pressure became too intense, perform a symbolic penance while privately rewarding the corrupt official for his loyalty to the institution. This system of protection meant that corrupt clergy could operate with virtual impunity. They knew that no matter how egregious their behavior, the Church would ultimately protect them as long as they continued to generate revenue and maintain institutional loyalty. This knowledge made them increasingly bold in their corruption, leading to ever more outrageous abuses of power. The economic impact of this corruption was staggering. The medieval church extracted wealth from society on a scale that modern economists struggle to comprehend. In some regions, church taxation exceeded royal taxation by substantial margins. When you added tithes, fees for services, mandatory donations, and the various forms of religious extortion, the church was collecting more money from ordinary people than all other institutions combined. This wealth extraction had devastating effects on economic development. Money that could have been invested in agriculture, commerce, or technological innovation was instead diverted to building elaborate churches, supporting corrupt clergy, and funding religious wars. The church's hoarding of wealth created artificial scarcity that kept ordinary people in poverty while religious leaders lived like medieval celebrities. The church's economic power also gave them enormous political influence. Kings needed church support to maintain legitimacy. Nobles required church blessing for their land holdings, and merchants depended on church cooperation for their trade networks. This political influence was used not to promote justice or serve the common good, but to protect and expand the church's corrupt practices. The corruption created a vicious cycle where political power was used to protect economic exploitation, which generated wealth that could be used to purchase more political power. The church became a state within the state, with its own laws, its own courts, its own military forces, and its own economic system, all designed to maximize institutional power and individual enrichment. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of medieval church corruption was how it poisoned genuine religious faith. People who desperately wanted to believe in God, who sincerely sought spiritual comfort and moral guidance, found themselves exploited by the very institution that claimed to represent divine love and mercy. This exploitation was particularly cruel because it targeted people at their most vulnerable moments. When someone was dying, when a child was sick, when a family was facing disaster, they turned to the church for help and found instead a bill collector with a religious education. Their faith was used against them, their hope was commercialized, and their desperation was treated as a business opportunity. The long-term psychological effects of this spiritual abuse are impossible to calculate, but they undoubtedly contributed to the cynicism and anti-clericalism that characterized much of medieval and early modern European culture. People learned to distinguish between the God they worshipped and the church that claimed to represent him, but the damage to religious faith was substantial and lasting. The corruption also had profound effects on intellectual and cultural development. The church's control over education meant that they could suppress ideas that threatened their authority, promote theories that served their interests, and generally shape human knowledge to protect their corrupt practices. Scientific inquiry was limited because it might challenge church-approved explanations of natural phenomena. Historical scholarship was constrained because it might reveal inconvenient truths about church behavior. Philosophical investigation was dangerous because it might lead to questions about religious authority. The church's corruption thus retarded human intellectual progress for centuries. The artistic and cultural impact was equally significant. Church patronage shaped medieval art, architecture, literature, and music, but this patronage was directed toward glorifying the church rather than exploring human experience or advancing artistic innovation. Artists learned to create works that flattered their corrupt patrons rather than expressing authentic vision or challenging social problems. The corruption even affected the physical landscape of medieval Europe. Vast resources that could have been used to improve agriculture, build infrastructure, or support technological development were instead devoted to constructing elaborate churches and monasteries that served primarily to display clerical wealth and power. These buildings were undoubtedly beautiful, and many remain architectural marvels today, but they represented a massive misallocation of social resources. The labor and materials used to build one grand cathedral could have constructed hundreds of schools, hospitals, or other institutions that would have actually served human needs rather than clerical vanity. The social effects of church corruption extended far beyond economics or politics. The church's example of moral hypocrisy gave people permission to behave unethically in their own lives. If God's representatives could lie, steal, and abuse their authority, why shouldn't ordinary people do the same? This moral corruption spread throughout medieval society like a contagious disease. Merchants learned to justify cheating customers by pointing to clerical dishonesty. Nobles excused their oppression of peasants by noting that church leaders oppressed their own followers. Kings rationalized their tyrannical behavior by observing that religious authorities were equally tyrannical. The church's corruption thus undermined the very moral foundation that society needed to function effectively. When the institution responsible for teaching and enforcing moral behavior was obviously immoral, the entire concept of ethical conduct became suspect. This moral decay had practical consequences that affected every aspect of medieval life. Legal systems became less reliable because people expected judges to be corrupt. Economic relationships became more difficult because trust was in short supply. Political institutions became less stable because authority was no longer respected. The corruption also created a culture of secrecy and deception that made effective governance nearly impossible. When everyone expected everyone else to be corrupt, honest cooperation became extremely difficult. Social problems went unsolved because addressing them would have required the kind of honest collaboration that corruption made impossible. But the most profound effect of medieval church corruption may have been its impact on the human spirit. People who had been taught that religious leaders were representatives of divine love and justice discovered instead that these leaders were motivated by greed, lust, and power. The psychological shock of this discovery left lasting scars on European civilization. The corruption taught people that authority figures could not be trusted, that institutions claiming moral purposes were likely to be immoral in practice, and that idealistic rhetoric was usually a cover for selfish behavior. These lessons, learned painfully over centuries of clerical abuse, shaped European attitudes toward authority, religion, and social reform for generations. When the Protestant Reformation finally arrived, it succeeded not because Luther and other reformers had brilliant new theological insights, but because they articulated what millions of people already knew from bitter experience. The medieval Catholic Church had become a corrupt institution that served itself rather than God or humanity. The Reformation was thus not just a religious revolution, but a consumer revolt, a political upheaval, and a social transformation all rolled into one. People weren't just changing their theological beliefs, they were rejecting centuries of institutional abuse and demanding accountability from religious leaders. The success of the Reformation demonstrated that even the most powerful and entrenched corrupt institutions can ultimately be challenged and changed when enough people decide they've had enough. But it also showed how much damage institutional corruption can do before reform becomes possible. The medieval Catholic Church's corruption was ultimately defeated, but the victory came at an enormous cost. Centuries of human potential were wasted, countless individuals suffered needlessly, and European civilization was set back by generations of clerical misrule. The lessons of this historical tragedy remain relevant today, because the basic human tendencies that created medieval church corruption still exist. People still seek power, still rationalize unethical behavior, still use noble ideals to justify ignoble actions. Institutions still resist accountability, still protect their own interests above their stated missions, still corrupt the people who lead them. Understanding medieval church corruption helps us recognize these patterns in contemporary institutions and take steps to prevent similar abuse. It reminds us that no institution, however sacred its mission or respected its traditions, is immune to corruption, and that eternal vigilance is indeed the price of institutional integrity.